So the recent reports suggest that on the morning of May 10th, when Russia launched its incursion into the Kharkiv region from two axes, although the Russians had initially amassed some 30,000 to 50,000 troops, which France 24 points out was fewer troops than Russia had sent to Bakhmut, a city of less strategic importance. Only about 5,000 of those Russian troops actually crossed the border into Kharkiv. Yet, within a week of fighting, Russia was able to advance 10 kilometers, or just over 6 miles deep from the border, and according to President Zelensky, as stated in the Financial Times, Russian forces had reached the first of 3 defensive lines that protect Kharkiv city, which, by the way, is approximately 35 kilometers from the border. What makes this advance even more alarming for Ukraine is the fact that, according to The Guardian, Ukraine had several warnings in advance. One of those warnings came from Kharkiv's regional governor, who reported on the amassing of Russian forces. Further, the UK Defense Intelligence also passed a warning to Ukraine's leadership about the Russian buildup. But despite all of this, when those 5,000 Russian soldiers crossed the Kharkiv border, Ukraine's defensive lines were described as being thin to absent. Harsh criticisms from Ukrainian commanders quickly followed, such as this statement right here. The first line of fortifications and mines just didn't exist. To another one saying, units were simply not prepared to fight. And lastly, that defenses were not properly positioned. By the middle of this week, fighting had reached the town of Vovchansk, just north of Lipsy and about 20 miles from Kharkiv city. If, therefore, Russia is able to advance just a further 5 miles, they would reach the necessary 15-mile range, enabling their 152mm artillery to be able to shell Kharkiv city. Also, just 2 days ago, the BBC reported that Ukraine had pulled back its troops from several villages in the border region of Kharkiv due to continued pressure from Russian forces so as to move to more advantageous positions. Meanwhile, Russia announced the capture of 2 more villages, Lukyansky and Haibuk, and also, interestingly, the village of Robotini, which is far away from the Kharkiv region in Zaporizhia down south, but was very significant morale-wise because Ukraine had spent months trying to capture it in the summer counteroffensive, and now that town is back in Russian hands. Vovchansk's police chief in Kharkiv, Oleksiy Kharkivsky, said that the Russians were taking positions on the streets in Vovchansk already. Now, to put these advances in perspective, many military experts are describing this as dire for the Ukrainian army. Ukraine's own General Budunov, head of Ukraine's intelligence, said that every hour the situation moves towards critical. He said that in a phone call from a bunker in Kharkiv to France 24. Simtak, a military analyst specializing in strategic geopolitical dynamics, called it the most significant push from the Russians in months. But today, my friends, we have some new reports that give even more detail as to how Putin's forces were able to generate such a successful and comparatively rapid offensive that seemingly caught Ukraine completely off guard despite the many warnings. And although many pro-Ukrainians try to compare this Russian offensive to the 2022 Ukrainian offensive that liberated large swaths of territory in the Kharkiv region, it must be remembered that the opposing sides have 2 very different military objectives of this war. Any territory lost for Ukraine is a hard blow to their morale and equates to a military setback, as their goal has always stated as being pre-1991 borders. The Russians, in contrast, are only focused on demilitarizing Ukraine, and thus territorial retreats are not damaging to their goals or morale unless that territory has some military significance. Put it simply, Ukraine fights for every inch of land, while Russia fights only to destroy the Ukrainian army. So with that context, let's get into today's video. Ukraine's 125th Territorial Defense Brigade who had been charged with monitoring the Kharkiv border, was stretched thin along a roughly 27-mile stretch of Kharkiv's border and were using reconnaissance drones to monitor daily Moscow buildup of troops. But something very strange occurred on the morning of May 10th that had not happened before. According to the Washington Post, on the morning of May 10th, the brigade lost all of its video feeds due to Russian electronic jamming. Further, its Starlink devices, which is satellite internet provided by Elon Musk and on which Ukraine relies for its basic communication, failed for the first time as it was knocked out completely. So let me take you back. You remember those images we saw of Russian soldiers capturing various Starlink terminals throughout Ukraine, most recently during their seizure of the Avdiivka coke and chemical plant in the Battle of Avdiivka in January of this year? Well, I speculate that perhaps they have figured out a way to reverse engineer the technology, allowing them to shut down the Starlink terminals whenever is necessary. This is likely yet another reason why the West has been very reserved about sending any high-tech or advanced weaponry to a beleaguered and untrained Ukrainian army in this war. They would be effectively risking its capture and giving free intelligence to the Kremlin. So in essence, the Ukrainians were left in the dark before the Kharkiv incursion by the Russians, and one Ukrainian drone unit commander who identified himself by his call sign Artist to the Washington Post in an interview described it as follows: "We were left at a certain point completely blind. This was our biggest problem," he said. "We didn't see how they were moving. We only worked through radio or through phones, wherever they still worked." Within days of the Russian incursion, Russia had captured around 50 square miles of territory along the Kharkiv border. In a brutally factual report from the Washington Post, it was pointed out that the amount of territory that Russia has occupied over the last several weeks is about as large as the territory Ukraine retook during its lackluster spring counteroffensive of 2023. This diagram here compares 6 months of the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year to just a few weeks of Russia's Kharkiv offensive. But this Russian success isn't only because of Ukraine's shortcomings. Begrudgingly, Ukrainian troops admit that the Russians have, and I quote, "gotten smarter and adapted, especially with technological advancements such as electronic warfare," which they say is a sharp contrast with the first year of the Russian invasion in 2022. This is why so many experts keep warning the West that this war, far from weakening or defeating the Russian army, has only made their army bigger and more advanced than it was before. But the real threat to Ukraine is that this Kharkiv offensive forces Ukraine to redirect reserves to the north. In my previous video, I quoted General Budanov, who said they had committed all of their reserves between Kharkov and Chasiv Yar, and they had, I quote, "nothing left." The other worrying issue for Ukraine, which has come to light in the media recently, is their lack of proper defense lines and fortifications. The aforementioned drone unit commander with the call sign Artist says that even as they watched Russian build-up forces, they remained unable to construct the kind of fortified lines they needed because they were in range of Russian artillery near the border. This is a point I made in a video I did called The Real Purpose of Bakhmut, where I theorized that it was done to buy time to build Russia's Surovikin defense line, and more importantly, asks the logical question: why did the Ukrainians just sit back and allow Russia to build this massive defense line unhampered? Why didn't the Ukrainians attack the Russians to try to interrupt the construction, which was done, by the way, by civilian contractor firms prior to the 2023 counteroffensive? I pose my theory in that video based on several reports which have not been read in Western media, and I suggest that you watch that video next. In Russia's case, Artist says that every time his troops stationed units on the Kharkiv border to try to build fortified lines, the Russians, using their own reconnaissance drones, would monitor the activity and fire upon them. Further, he says that the terrain also isn't favorable to such construction by mere shovels. Artists described the soil as being heavy, making it tough to dig with shovels, and stated that they needed artillery to protect them while they hired the necessary excavators. And thus it seems the armor shortage that plagues the Ukrainian army has therefore proven dire not only on the active fronts, but in less active areas where preparations needed to be built. But the Russians must also deserve credit, as they reportedly picked their attack points smartly, moving between rivers that could be used as natural cover to disguise the initial phases of the offensive. The assault on the city of Vovchansk, which the Russians have already entered, by the way, could give Russia a lane to move towards Kupiansk, while a second flank attack on Lipsy could put Russian forces in range to shell Kharkiv city. But it now seems confirmed that Western experts do not deem this a major offensive or attempt to take Kharkiv city. Dara Masikot, senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasian program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, said that Russia has resourced this as a limited incursion for a buffer zone rather than an attempt to occupy the entirety of Kharkiv all at once. However, she did note that this may just be phase one of a long-term Russian plan. What I think makes this rapid advance by the Russians ever more embarrassing for the Kiev regime is that all the reports say that the units Russia has deployed were newly formed units with less experience and in many cases consist of recently trained Russian convicts. However, as Commander Ihor of one of the Ukrainian brigades that had been redirected to Kharkiv recently, the National Guard's Katia, said, while Russians use similar tactics as they did in Bakhmut, that being using groups of infantry to attack in waves, the groups sent to Kharkiv have more than 15 soldiers each, which is almost twice what was sent in Bakhmut. Previously, he said they walked in groups of 3 people each, but now they are making big advances with 20 people. The glide bombs also pose a problem because, he said, unlike missiles, the bombs cannot be intercepted by air defense. This therefore forces Ukraine to constantly have to change their position by sometimes up to 1,000 feet multiple times a day, because if they are spotted, a glide bomb will surely soon follow. As to the Russian goals, the commander thinks the Russians will simply advance as far as they can until they are stopped, and if they get entrenched, they will build concrete fortifications and be very difficult to dislodge. A Vietnamese media outlet gave some more insight as to Ukraine's manpower situation on the battlefield. Based on a source from the French military that was quoted in Radio Free Europe, it says that Ukrainian military units on average lack 40% of their manpower and are having problems due to desertion. The same French military source said, and I quote, all Ukrainian brigades lost 40% of their manpower, while at the same time facing a wave of desertion among young military personnel. But on the bright side, it seems Western leaders are becoming more ready for peace. According to the same Radio Free Europe, Western servicemen are beginning to realize that the changing situation in Ukraine and admit Kiev will have to negotiate with Russia before it opens another front. Remember what General Budanov said about that very same topic in my last video. Go check it out right here. Meanwhile, politically, the gravity of the situation in Kharkiv is made crystal clear by President Zelensky, who cancelled a planned trip to Spain to come to Kharkiv because of the offensive. He said in an interview with ABC News that the situation is very serious. We cannot afford to lose Kharkiv. Zelensky then went on to blame the entire world for what is happening, when he also told the ABC team, when asked if it is America's fault for what is happening in Kharkiv. The president said, and I quote, "It's the world's fault. They gave the opportunity for Putin to occupy."
How serious is the situation right now?
It's difficult, it's serious, so brigades are not totally equipped because of the package which we waited through 8 months.
What's happening now in Kharkiv? Is this America's fault?
It's the fault of the world that the world gave possibility of Putin to occupy the country, and I think so. But now the world can help.
Then President Zelensky went on to say something that supports my theory on the recent $61 billion aid package. Zelensky told the ABC, and get this, in quotations, the money is not given to Ukraine. The money is spent in American factories creating American jobs. In opposition, Politico reports that President Putin made it clear earlier today that Russia did not plan on capturing Kharkiv city in this offensive.
Вот мы это и делаем. Что касается Харькова, то таких планов на сегодняшний день нет.
President Putin said in an address, when it comes to what is happening around Kharkiv, that is their fault too, because they have been shelling and sadly continue to target residential neighborhoods in the border areas, including Belgorod. President Putin continued, and I have publicly said that this will continue. We will be forced to create a safe zone. That is what we are doing.
On Friday, it's launched a significant new invasion, and it's frankly depressing. They've not found the Ukrainians ready. We've not driven past significant fortifications on the way to here. Ukraine's military talking about how they've moved to more favourable positions over the last 24 hours. That's sort of their euphemism for a form of retreat. So all of this is a reflection of how Russia appears to have got its resources together, to have turned its economy into a wartime one and regained its focus and its manpower, while Ukraine has been left with its morale cratered because the 6 months it's had to wait for that $61 billion. And in a key moment like this, where Russia has launched an entirely new offensive in a different direction, they now have to make choices about where they send the troops to hold that back. And we're also seeing Russia making advances in the east too. So this is frankly a catastrophic moment for Kiev, a change in the war, and something reflected in Zelensky deciding not to make those urgent visits to allies in the days ahead. We're into a very grave moment here.